By the end of this video, you are going to know everything you need to know for your first trip to Norway, from tips on how to save money, all the way to common mistakes to avoid, learned the hard way from experience. In case you're new here, hi, I'm Christina from happytowander.com, and this channel is all about practical travel tips from someone who's been there, done that. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, be sure to like and subscribe for more. I've been to Norway twice now, including the dreamiest 10-day trip this past summer, so I'm really excited to share all my tips with you. Starting first off with travel planning tips for Norway. Now the first one is simply to prepare your wallet for some really high prices throughout your trip. Now, Norway is a notoriously pricey destination, but that's not to say that you can't actually enjoy it on a budget. I will be sharing tons of tips throughout this video about how to save money during your trip, but just to get your expectations straight, here are some examples of prices based on my recent trip. Now, a main course for a sit-down meal will typically range between 250 to 450 krona, which is about 25 to 45 US dollars. Most coffees out will cost about 50 to 60 krona. A cinnamon bun, which is an important metric, will cost between 50 to 60 krona. A beer will cost 120 to 160 krona. And a gas station hot dog will cost between 70 to 90 krona. So as you can see, with the exception of alcohol, which is notoriously expensive in Norway, the prices, they're not cheap by any means, but they're not as prohibitively expensive as some guides will suggest. Making money matters a bit more confusing though is the fact that of course in Norway they use their own currency, which is the Norwegian krona. For some first-time visitors, it may take some time to adjust to this currency, which is why another tip of mine is to figure out a quick mental shortcut that you can use for converting prices on the go. So during my most recent trip, for instance, 100 Norwegian krona was equivalent to about 940 US dollars. So I just rounded up and kind of used the mental calculation that 100 krona was about 10 US dollars, which really helped me figure out what was a good deal and where I was potentially getting ripped off. So I would recommend finding a similar mental shortcut that will help you do the math a lot easier. So before your trip, make sure you are Googling what the current conversion rate is and then creating a kind of mental shortcut that you can personally use. You can, of course, also just download a currency conversion app for your phone if you don't trust yourself to do the mental calculations. A very popular one is simply called Currency. All right, next up, let's chat about where to go. My main tip for this really is to avoid planning your trip around the major Instagram hotspots. Based on personal experience, I found that if you try to craft an itinerary based only on the pretty photos that you've seen on social media, the most famous places that you've seen on Instagram and Pinterest, oftentimes these locations are so spread apart that if you try to craft your itinerary around them, then you create a super stressful and really unrealistic itinerary. So definitely avoid doing that. Don't forget, Norway is a really long country, so it spans a lot north to south, meaning landscapes can really vary dramatically depending on where you go. And also because of that, often there's really large distance gaps between some of the most common touristy sites. So what I would personally recommend is not just trying to hop from major hotspot to major hotspot, but instead focusing on one region and really exploring that region thoroughly. And that way you're also more likely to find hidden gems and spots that are a bit more off the beaten path. If there's one thing I learned while researching my trip to Norway, it's that for every super famous destination, there's often a much less famous alternative that's going to have a fraction of the crowds but is still super stunning. So be sure to do plenty of research, starting first with what your goals are for the trip and then branching out from there. If your goal is to see really dramatic mountains and fjords, for instance, you might be better off going to Western Norway, like Bergen and the Western Fjords, for instance, or the Geiranger Fjord area, rather than the east, which is much flatter and less dramatic. There's also quieter beaches and islands to the south, as well as dramatic landscapes and wildlife up north, which is also ideal for those who are looking for northern lights in the winter, or perhaps chasing midnight sun in the summer. And if you're looking for more modern architecture or more cultural offerings, then the capital city of Oslo might be more your speed. Or if you're really into history, maybe Trondheim should be worth adding to your itinerary. Overall, once you have your main region of choice decided, then you can dig a little bit deeper and try to find some more of those hidden gems or ones that are at least not as touristy as some of the main hotspots that a lot of people already know about. The official tourism board website is actually a really great resource for this, as are local bloggers that are based in Norway. One of my favorites on Instagram is called Helene Moo. Her account is gorgeous and she has lots of really great Norway recommendations. So I truly believe that so long as you pack properly and have the right clothing, there's no bad season to be visiting Norway. There's really a lot to offer year-round in this country, depending on what you're after. Of course, your main priorities for the trip are going to dictate the best time to go. So again, if your main goal is Northern Lights, for instance, the peak period for that is between November and March, as this is when nights are at their longest. Of course, this means more limited daylight hours, so make sure you're always weighing those pros and cons. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're hoping to make the most of long summer days, then mid-June to July is the best, especially north of the Arctic Circle, where you get to experience the incredible phenomenon that is the midnight sun, also known as the time of the year when the sun literally does not set and instead just kind of dips close to the horizon and glides across the horizon instead of it actually getting dark. This was the main purpose for my recent trip to Lofoten, and I loved it. It was such a cool experience being able to hike at 2 a.m., but I warn you, this does really wreak havoc on your sleep schedule, so be sure to keep that in mind. Of course, summer in Norway does give you the best chance at the best weather in the country, but there is one significant downside that I didn't actually anticipate during my trip, and that is that, of course, June, July, and August are the optimal months to be working on construction and roadworks as well. For the exact same reasons that it's easier for you to visit during those times, it's also easier for them to actually be able to do work because it's warmer and the days are longer. So do be mindful that if you visit Norway during the summer, you're probably going to encounter a fair share of roadworks and also construction. Another downside of summer travel that I didn't expect is that it can get really hot in the hotels as well when there's no AC. And this is just because depending on which way your window is facing, because the sun doesn't set or it sets for a short period of time, you're gonna have that sun streaming into the window the entire day. And so it's gonna create kind of like a greenhouse effect and make it really hot. So do be mindful of that and don't be like baking in a beautiful sauna like I did for a lot of my trip. Of course, the shoulder seasons of spring and fall also have their pros and cons. Specifically, if you visit during the spring, May 17th is actually the Norwegian Constitution Day, which is the main national holiday. So you're gonna see a lot of fun events like parades and people dressed in their national dress as well. So definitely keep that in consideration. Do keep in mind though that in Norway there is actually quite a big difference between peak season and off-season schedules when it comes to trains and things like that, especially in touristy areas. So it is possible that if you're trying to do a touristy train ride, for instance, that's only open for a portion of the year starting in the summer, for instance. So be sure to look into that before you book anything. And speaking of dressing properly for the elements, this week's video is brought to you by Unbound Merino, a brand that you'll probably recognize from a lot of the videos of me on this trip. And that's just because I was wearing it all throughout my hikes, and it really saved me because of how versatile and simple the designs are. I could wear the same tank top for a nice hike and be completely comfortable, and then later wear that with some more casual shorts and just walk around town. So if you haven't heard of it before, merino wool is this really great fabric that is, contrary to popular belief, not just good for base layers in the winter, but also really ideal for summer travel because it can be woven super thin, can be very breathable, and keep you nice and cool, but also wick all that moisture, all that bacteria, etc., so that you're not left with a damp smelling shirt at the end of a long hike. I can definitely attest that these shirts do not smell even after climbing a literal mountain. And so I could re-wear the same top multiple times without needing to wash it, which was really handy. For my 10-day trip, all I had was one backpack and a carry-on suitcase, and a large reason why I was able to do that is because I just had a few Unbound Merino items that I just kept re-wearing. So if you're interested in packing light and you also want something that's going to transition from hiking in the mountains to relaxing out in the city, then definitely look into it. All right, thanks again to Unbound Merino for sponsoring this week's video. Now let's get back to the tips. Now, in terms of accommodation, I do have to say that while Norway is known for being a really expensive destination, hotels and accommodation in general actually offers pretty solid value for money, especially if you book ahead of time. So in mid-June, for instance, booking in advance got us this amazing modern 2-bedroom apartment with an epic view for about $200 a night, which is really not bad at all considering a single beer is going to set you back about $12. That said, if you are planning a longer trip, I definitely recommend booking a place with a kitchen, just because, as we'll discuss later, dining out is probably one of the biggest costs when it comes to traveling around Norway. So having your own kitchen is going to save you a ton of money. That said, most hotels will offer a free breakfast that's included in the room rate, and from personal experience, these hotel breakfasts tend to be really hearty, really filling, so that's definitely going to be another money saver as well. A fair warning though, beware that air conditioning is not a given in Norwegian hotels, especially because they don't tend to need it most times of the year. So before you book a hotel, if air conditioning is important to you, make sure to read closely in their amenities list to see if they have that, because it's definitely not a common thing that you're gonna find in every hotel. Another thing to be mindful of when it comes to hotels in Norway is that you should really be familiarizing yourself with Norwegian and Nordic hotel chains. And this is just because from what I've seen in a lot of the major cities, you're going to encounter a lot of the same chains kind of throughout. And while I do like staying in unique and boutique properties whenever possible, oftentimes if you're looking to save some money, it does pay off to be loyal to one particular hotel chain. And it is quite easy to do this in Norway because again, there are some chains that are just present all throughout the country and also have different lines within their companies, so they have different options that cater to various budgets as well. So the largest hotel chain in the Nordics is Scandic, but some other common ones include Thun, Radisson, Best Western, and Strawberry, which encompasses a few different chains, including Clarion Hotels and Comfort Hotels. In some of the major cities like Bergen and Oslo, you're also going to find Citybox, which is one that I stayed with, and its whole concept is that they have really centrally located properties with not a lot of frills in the rooms, but they're nicely designed, and where they really cut corners is the customer service. You literally check yourself in with a machine. So I honestly really liked this approach, and I can definitely recommend staying at one of their properties as well, especially if you're booking last minute like I was and you're on a bit of a budget. Of course, if you're really on a budget, you should know that camping is one of the most affordable ways to enjoy Norway's epic nature. In fact, Norway is known as one of the best countries in Europe for camping because of its right to roam, which means that you are able to do wild camping in Norway subject to certain restrictions. So be sure to consider this option if you're looking for something that's a bit more budget friendly. For those coming from overseas who don't want to lug over their equipment, you can actually look at different businesses that will rent you the equipment as well. You can also potentially rent a camper van, although beware that the rules for camper vans and RVs in general are a bit stricter. You can't just pitch up anywhere, but there are a lot of campsites and parking lots that will allow you to park overnight. Finally, keep in mind that Norway is largely a cash-free country, meaning you're going to be using card payments most of the time. So if you don't already have a good credit or debit card that minimizes fees abroad, make sure you have one in advance of your trip. I've been using Wise for the past few years and I've never had any issues, so check out my referral link to get a free transfer. Another common payment option that you'll encounter in Norway is called VIPS, but do be aware that VIPS is really only for people who are living in Norway, because when you try to make an account, as I learned the hard way, they do ask you for a national identity number. So if you ever come across anywhere that only accepts VIPS, do know that you're not going to be able to use that as a tourist. I did encounter a few parking lots that only accepted VIPS, so beware of that. Now let's move on to the next section, which is about public transport and getting around Norway. So first, you should know that public transport in Norway is truly excellent, especially if you're trying to get between major cities. The best website to search up different transport options is called Entur, and it'll show you options from across Norway's many transport operators, including main train operators. You can also book through them as well. I am a huge fan of train travel in Norway. I found the options to be very clean, very convenient, very scenic, and if you book ahead, actually not too bad in terms of price. Because pricing is dynamic in Norway, buying sooner rather than later is really the only key to saving big on train travel. During my recent trip, I actually did the longest train ride possible in Norway, which is from Bodø up in the north down to Trondheim, and then onwards to Oslo from Trondheim. So having done both of those, I found them very, very enjoyable, and I can definitely recommend taking the train if you have the time to spare. Of course, Norway, as we've established, is quite a large country, so taking the train is not necessarily going to be the quickest option. Instead, if time is of the essence, you can also look into domestic flights. So Norway actually has 50+ domestic airports, and I believe it's actually the country with the most flights per capita in Europe, so flying is definitely a really common option. Especially because a lot of them are pretty well priced, like SAS, Norwegian, and Widerøe. That said, driving is definitely more ideal if you're hoping to get the most of Norway's epic landscapes and scenery. And also if you're hoping to get maybe a bit more off the beaten path and get away from the crowds, having a car is going to be really essential for that. So usually I'll use Discover Cars because they are a really great website for comparing a bunch of different car rental companies at the same time. Unfortunately, renting a car can be quite pricey in Norway. For our week-long trip in Lofoten, for instance, our week-long car rental was about 8,000 krona, which is definitely not cheap. But looking at the views, it was worth every penny. Now, if you do plan to drive, a really handy must-know is to download the Easy Park app, which allows you to pay for parking directly on your phone and also adjust your parking as well. So let's say you go off on a hike and it's taking longer than you expected, you can actually adjust that on your phone without having to go back to the payment machine on site. So this is really handy. It's probably one of the best parking apps I've ever used, and make sure you download it because it makes your life way easier when you're driving around Norway. Now, while a rental car is by far the best way to explore at your own pace, I do have to say that Norway is tremendously well connected by a network of buses, trains, and ferries. So if you're willing to work around public transport schedules, it's definitely not a deal breaker if you've always wanted to do this dream trip, but you're not able to rent a car. Now, bridging rental cars and public transport are some made-for-tourist options like the Arctic bus up in Lofoten. So these will usually cost quite a bit more than regular public transport options, but they specifically go to places of touristic interest and tend to be a little bit more comfortable as well. So if you're looking for a middle ground, that could be something to explore, but the only thing I'll say is to make sure you are comparing prices, because when I was looking at the Arctic bus, actually after crunching all the numbers, it turned out to be cheaper to split a car rental with my friend. So don't just assume that these buses are going to be the cheaper option, but keep them in mind if you're trying to compare all the different possibilities. Finally, just as a warning, do beware that taxis in Norway can be atrociously expensive. So please do yourself a favor and never assume that taxis in Norway can't possibly be that bad considering the distance they're going. Because I will tell you, we stayed at an airport hotel that was a 15-minute walk from the airport, and we could see it from the airport, and it was only going to be like a 3-minute drive. And guess what the designated price for that 3-minute journey was? 500 krona. About $50 US. Of course, we ended up just walking on the highway at the behest of the taxi driver himself, who said that it wasn't going to be worth it. So definitely beware of taxis in Norway. They are atrociously expensive. Now let's cover some culture and etiquette tips for Norway. In terms of learning Norwegian, don't worry, most Norwegians speak truly excellent English, so you don't need to worry too much about mastering the language before your trip, especially if you're in touristy areas or you're dealing with anybody that works in the tourism sector. They are going to be able to help you in English. In fact, at the Oslo airport, I almost felt like I saw more English than Norwegian, so that's definitely not going to be too much of an issue. But as I always say, it is polite to learn how to say hi and thank you, at least in the local language. So hi, you can just say hi, it's very easy, and thank you is just talk. Now, while most Norwegians do speak great English, one thing I did notice is that not all signs and menus will be in English as well. So make sure you are at least downloading a translation app to be used on your phone. My go-to is Google Translate, and with that you can very easily just scan menus and get it translated into English. And you can also download it for offline use as well, so that you're able to use it even when you don't have internet. Now, let's talk tips. Are you supposed to tip in Norway? So here's some good news considering the country's sky-high prices. Tipping culture is pretty much non-existent in Norway, and tips are definitely not expected, although if someone has given you exceptional service in a restaurant, it might be nice to round up a little bit, but usually this is no more than 5 to 10%. Servers in Norway are paid a living wage, so you really don't need to tip, and it's definitely not expected. Although I will say in certain nicer restaurants and places that were more geared towards tourists, like in hotel bars for instance, I was always given the option to tip on the card machine, so maybe it's becoming a bit more common, who knows, but know that it's not expected to the extent that it is in North America. Now, because Norway is predominantly cashless, you wouldn't typically leave a tip with cash. Instead, when they hand you the card machine, you're going to be given the option to type in the total amount that you want to pay, including tip. I did notice in some fancier places, there was also the option to press different buttons for different percentages to add onto your bill, but for the most part, what I encountered was just the machine asking you to enter the total that you wanted to pay. Now, in terms of general etiquette, it's all really basic, but just do try to be respectful as much as possible. Don't jump queues, keep your distance, and do avoid speaking too loudly in public. I personally found that Norwegians were really friendly once you actually started chatting with them, but there isn't so much that culture of just approaching strangers and having small talk on the street or sitting next to strangers to strike up a conversation. So do be mindful of that. They tend to be pretty big fans of their personal space. The one major exception to this, though, is on hiking trails. It is very common to make eye contact and give them a quick hi, because I think it's just a hiker's code of conduct, no matter where you go in the world. Another important politeness reminder is to always pick up after yourself, especially when you're out in naturey destinations. So generally speaking, I found that Norwegians are really accepting and welcoming of tourists, but the main complaint and gripe that they have is when tourists don't properly clean up after themselves. Again, especially when you're out in Norway's pristine nature. So anything you bring out with you, make sure you're bringing back. Don't litter, because they obviously don't like that. And it goes without saying, make sure to respect nature as well, so keep on the trails if you're hiking. Now let's move on to some food and drink tips for Norway. First, do keep in mind that Norwegian tap water is absolutely delicious and it is absolutely free. So unless you want sparkling water, there really is no reason to be paying for bottled water when you're in Norway. The tap water there is outrageously delicious. Now, if you're on a budget, I cannot stress this enough, but dining out in Norway is so expensive and is going to be by far your biggest expense if you're dining out every single meal. As I said before, when you're dining out, main courses typically range between 250 to 450 krona, which of course can add up if you're dining out every single day. So make sure you are getting groceries, even if it's just for lunches and things like that, because that is going to save you a ton of money. If you're especially on a budget, do be mindful that some supermarkets are known as low-cost supermarkets compared to others. So my personal favorite was Rema 1000. I really liked it there. The prices were super affordable and the stores seemed to have everything you could ever want. But some other popular options include Kiwi and also Co-op Extra. In a pinch, gas stations often have some basics as well, but do beware that oftentimes the prices at gas stations will be 1.5 to 2 times more than at a regular supermarket. Now, some local brands of random Norwegian things I really enjoyed include Isklar water, which is Norwegian sparkling glacier water. The flavored ones especially are so good. There's also Freya chocolate. The hazelnut one is my favorite. As well as Grandiosa frozen pizza, which I've been told is actually quite a household staple, and they're shaped like hearts, which is very cute. Now, as a last note for grocery shopping, do note that a lot of supermarkets will actually have a special section where they sell marked down items, usually things that are going to be expiring soon. So if you're going to be consuming it that day, it's not a big deal. So be sure to keep an eye out for any of those specials as well. All that said, if you have the funds for it, do be sure to treat yourself and splurge a little and try a few meals out, because honestly, every single meal I had out when I was in Norway was so fresh and so outstanding. I don't know if I was just lucky and picked the right restaurants, but everything just tasted really good. So definitely try at least one nice restaurant meal just to round out your experience. Now, if you do end up dining out, there are some Norwegian classic specialties that I think you should have on your radar. So some common ones include finnbiff, which is a reindeer stew, kjøttkaker in brun sauce, gosh, I'm really butchering these pronunciations, but those are meatballs in a brown gravy. Brunost, which is brown cheese, like this caramelized cheese that you can get with waffles, and it sounds weird, but it's so good. As well as Norwegian style waffles, which are adorably heart-shaped. So do note though that these aren't typically just a breakfast food, they are kind of like a sweet treat that you can enjoy anytime. So keep an eye out for them at cafes and things as like a mid-afternoon pick-me-up. And as a random note, if you find yourself at a bakery, do try more than just cinnamon buns. So I know that cinnamon buns are kind of like a quintessential Norwegian treat, but honestly, you'd be doing yourself a disservice by only trying cinnamon buns while you're in Norway. A lot of these bakeries have tons of other delicious buns that are just as good. So I had a chocolate one, for instance, in Trondheim that I'm still actively thinking about. And also cardamom buns are very well known as well. Now, if you are dining out, based on my personal experience, do beware that some of the more casual restaurants actually offer bar service or self-service. So with bar service, this typically means that no server is going to come to your table to take your order. Instead, you go up to the bar, you place your order, and they'll typically give you a table number, or you'll tell them what table you're sitting at, and they'll bring the food to you. With self-service, you actually just grab everything yourself and then bring it to the counter and pay. I notice this on a lot of the ferries, for instance. So if you're sitting at a table and no server has come for a really long time, it's not that they hate you, maybe just look around for a sign that says that it is self-service or bar service, and maybe that's the reason why nobody has come to help you out. For road trips especially, this is maybe an unorthodox tip, but I do highly recommend trying some of the hot meals that are available at gas stations. So trust me, I know how that sounds. In North America, I would not go near a gas station hot dog, but actually the gas stations in Norway have some pretty excellent options. There's a few different popular chains, but Circle K is by far my favorite. At Circle K, you'll find a large selection of really delicious hot dogs, as well as pizzas and really good ice cream as well. By dining at gas stations, you'll often get a hot meal that's really filling and quite tasty for less than 100 krona, so that's definitely good if you're on a budget. And for longer road trips, do consider that a lot of the gas stations offer a special cup that you can buy that gives you unlimited hot drinks. So it's just a refillable cup, go into any of the gas stations of that chain and fill up your cup. So definitely worth it if you're a coffee guzzler like me. And again, as a bonus tip, at gas stations as well, they'll often have marked down items that are about to expire. So if you're especially on a budget, do keep an eye out for those as well. All right, let's finish this video off with some miscellaneous tips for once you arrive in Norway. So the first is to beware that a lot of shops and supermarkets are actually closed on Sundays. Although some supermarket chains are starting to open exceptionally on Sundays. Luckily, a lot of them actually have their hours printed in really bold print, just like next to the name of the store, so keep an eye out for that. Another shopping related tip is to beware that alcohol sales in Norway are really restricted. And so you can't just buy it anywhere, anytime, like in some other European countries. I'm not sure if this is a blanket rule across the entire country, but based on what I observed, it seems like supermarkets are only able to carry alcoholic beverages up to 4.7% alcohol content, which means even if you want a bottle of wine, you're gonna have to go to a special alcohol store known as a vinmonopolet, or a wine monopoly, which is literally what it is. There's also restrictions on when you can purchase this alcohol. So during my trip, for instance, again, this might vary depending on the location, but I saw that alcohol could not be sold after 8 p.m. on weekdays, and on Saturdays, not after 6 p.m., whereas no sales are allowed on Sundays and certain holidays. So definitely keep that in mind. Although I will say, overall, alcohol is so expensive in Norway, I wouldn't necessarily prioritize buying it when you're there. But a random fun fact I learned is that because there are quite extensive restrictions on how much you're able to mark up alcohol in Norway, it's actually cheaper in Norway to buy really expensive and fancy wine compared to a lot of other countries. So if you're a fancy wine connoisseur, be sure to stock up when you're in Norway, because a lot of those pricey bottles can actually be relatively affordable compared to other places. Now, if you're planning on driving in Norway, do be so careful with where you park, because Norwegian parking police have no mercy, and also the signage, to be very honest with you, is not great. And if you can sense any bitterness in my voice, it's because I learned this firsthand when I parked at what looked like a very normal parking spot, only to find a ticket after coming back from a fairly disappointing hike. And so do always pay attention to any signs that show with arrows where you're supposed to park. Do not trust that other people know where to park, because that herd mentality is what caused us to park in the wrong place without realizing. So always look for markers on the floor. Always look out for signs that say matavgift, because that is going to mean for a fee, meaning you need to pay to park there. So I'm not going to bore you with the details, but oftentimes these signs are not very clear, and the markings on the parking stalls are not clear either, so do not fall into this trap. They are very good at policing this, and the fines are fairly steep. That said, one hack that I did find if you're very paranoid about parking in the wrong place is that usually when you look at the parking lots on Google Maps, if someone has been given a ticket there, they will leave a very bad review. So that's an easy way to tell which areas you're allowed to park in and where you're not, and also areas that you might need to be a bit more careful, because people will generally tell you, oh, I parked here and I got a ticket. So it'll tell you very clearly what not to do. Now, another super specific tip is to know that Norwegian windows actually often open in special ways. So the initial open, if it seems quite restrictive, it could be possible that you just don't know how to open it fully. So be on the lookout for any latches or locks that you can undo, which can help you push the window out the entire way. This took me way too long to figure out, but as you can see from this example, you can often open the windows much wider than you expect. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope those tips were helpful, and be sure to like and subscribe for more. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.